Hi, everyone. I can see everybody is trickling in, so I'm just going to give everybody about a minute or so that you can get settled. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Mythbusting, Sustainable Seafood and Plastics Explained. I'm Anna Pham, Restaurants Canada Director of Content, and on behalf of our organization, I firstly want to thank you all for taking out the time to be joining us for learnings that actually drives really meaningful change. And as we're all here virtually from various places across this beautiful land, I'd also like to take a moment as well to express our deep respect and gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who have been the stewards of this nation for generations. We are definitely reminded that the knowledge of how to live and work in harmony with the environment is not new. Indigenous communities have long understood the importance of respecting the earth and living sustainably, and we know that our industry relies on the health of this planet. So today, as we discuss critical topics like greenwashing in plastics and sourcing sustainable seafood, we are inspired by this wisdom and recognizing that it is our responsibility to also act as stewards of the planet for future generations and also to continue to feed all of our communities. And so some housekeeping rules. Please feel free to add questions into the Q&A box below, and the OceanWise team can answer after the presentation. And of course, as per every single webinar that we do, a recording and any supporting resources and contact information will be sent out to all who are registered to the webinar 24 to 48 hours after. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the OceanWise team. We have Jeff Wint, the manager of the Plastics Reductions Program, and Natalie Graham, accounts manager for Fisheries and Seafood.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. So thank you everyone for being here. As you said, my name is Jeff, and I am part of the OceanWise Ocean Pollution and Plastics Initiative. And I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And today we're going to be talking about plastics. For myself and my colleague Natalie will be talking about sustainable seafood. So first, I'd like to start by asking everyone a question. What is your favorite memory of the ocean? The reason I ask that is we're all ocean people. The ocean gives us life. It provides the oxygen that we need to breathe, food to eat. It helps to regulate our climate, provides a lot of economic opportunities. It offers cultural and spiritual enrichment, and so much more. If you're one of those lucky people that are operating or working at a restaurant that is by the water, you know how important that is to all your guests. So often when I ask this question, what comes out and what's always really special is that while everyone's stories are unique and individual, they always have two really powerful elements in common. One is the way that the ocean made people feel, and the other one is the loved ones that they shared those moments with. So for me, I fell in love with the ocean from an early age, and many of my most treasured and vivid memories as a child are at the ocean with my family. I used to love exploring all the little tidal pools around Boundary Bay and Spanish Banks here in Vancouver, and finding all the little creatures and life in those pools. One of the other things I would find a lot in those tidal pools and on the shoreline was a lot of garbage and debris, styrofoam, old fishing gear, bottles, bags, all kinds of things. So I've worked in the waste management industry for more than 10 years now, and what it's really shown me is the scale of things that get thrown out every day. If you haven't ever been, go to a landfill, go to a transfer station, and just watch all of the garbage coming in and getting dumped and getting dumped. There's also so many touch points that an item needs to get from your hands or a consumer's hands into the proper disposal area, whether it's a landfill or a recycling center. So many touch points. And for items like a coffee cup that might get used for what? A couple minutes, is it really worth it? Being part of this work has really shown me that reduction, where possible, makes the most economic and environmental sense. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and go back to that favorite memory that you were thinking about a moment ago. How does it make you feel? Who are you sharing that moment with? Now imagine that moment and what it would have been like if you were surrounded by all the plastic pollution that's in the ocean. And think about those impacts. So like Anna mentioned, we are OceanWise. We are a globally focused conservation organization, and we're on a mission to restore and protect our oceans. We do that through research, education, public engagement, and international collaborations. We empower the communities that we work in to fight the three major ocean challenges: ocean pollution, overfishing, and climate change. We do that by equipping and empowering individuals, communities, industries, and governments. By doing that, we can create a future where people and the oceans can thrive. Why? Because we need the oceans and the ocean needs us. So on the ground, how are we doing this? OceanWise has identified, like I mentioned, three key challenges that threaten a healthy ocean: climate change, overfishing, and ocean pollution. To address those, we work on a few different areas. One, deforestation, which is restoring and building kelp forests, fisheries and seafood, which is probably our most well-known program, and one that my colleague Natalie is going to speak about in a few moments. We do some work on whales. We do some work on plastics and ocean pollution, which is where I work. And then also a lot of work around youth and education, which is really important. And it's all connected to the conservation work that we do. And we have teams that are actively working on each of these initiatives using our science-backed conservation lens. So why should we care about plastic pollution? So we know that plastic is one of the most pervasive man-made materials on Earth, and manufacturing of plastic has been rapidly increasing since the 1950s. So in 2020 alone, which if we all remember was obviously a bit of a different year with an economic downturn, but we still produced more than 4 million tons of virgin plastic. And plastic's an amazing material. It's lightweight, it's durable, it's cheap, it can be flexible, it can be rigid, it can be molded into any kind of shape that you need. Those are all great properties for the product, but it's also those combination of features that means the plastic often finds its way out into the environment, either by accident or on purpose. And then it stays there for a long time. That durability that is so good in products is a real detriment once it gets out into the environment. In 2016, it was estimated that there was 11 million tons of plastic entering the ocean each year, and that has been steadily increasing. That's about the same as a garbage truck of compacted plastic getting dumped every minute into the ocean. So we would have already dumped, 8 garbage trucks of plastic since I've started talking. And a little sidebar here. When we talk about plastic waste, and plastics in the marketplace, we use the word estimated a lot. It's because we don't really know the extent of plastic. So even the plastics industry and consumer packaged goods companies that put all of that plastic out into the market, they don't have a great handle on how much plastic they're actually putting out into the world. And they're spending a lot of money each year trying to calculate how much plastic they put out there and falling short. That's one of the reasons for some regulation that we'll talk about a little bit later on. And when plastic ends up in the ocean, it harms wildlife as well as the environment. There's issues like entanglement, which are easy to see. There's also ingestion, which is a significant issue, and it can cause problems like limited reproduction or starvation, which ultimately reduce survival of that animal. For example, we did a study on polyester, plastic microfibers, and what they're doing to the zooplankton, which are at the bottom of the food chain. That study is available on our website if you would like to read more about it. So where is all this plastic coming from? And when we think about how plastic is leaking out into the environment and where it's going, we often have a not in my backyard train of thought. Like we don't think about it happening here in North America. We always think about it kind of being elsewhere over there. You know, pictures of rivers of plastic in developing nations are often what come to mind. But what's not always acknowledged is that most high-income countries like Canada play a major role in the plastic pollution crisis. Decisions about disposable plastic packaging are often made in North America or in Europe, and high-income countries are still putting a lot of plastic into the waterways and into the ocean. As you can see from our 2013 Dirty Dozen, we are finding a lot of plastic coming out from individuals onto the shoreline, onto riverbanks, and a lot of that is food packaging. The items that we find on this Dirty Dozen list, they always change a little bit year to year, but we consistently see cigarette butts and we consistently see food packaging as major contributors to the plastic pollution that we find. So some of the myths that I'm going to be talking about here today, some of the things I'm hoping to explain, the regulatory landscape for plastic, some of the problematic plastics that you should be avoiding, some of the reliable certifications and labels that you might find out there, compostable plastics and bioplastics, which I know is a major source of confusion for a lot of people. We'll talk quickly about some meaningful metrics and wish cycling. And then we'll talk about some practical tips for managing recycling and waste in your front of house and back of house, and how that's actually going to affect your restaurants. So the plastics landscape changes frequently as governments take more action against unnecessary and problematic plastics. The regulations and bylaws that affect your business may differ depending on your location, whether you're in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg, wherever you might be. Restaurants Canada and Sophie put out this great guide last year or the year before called Single-Use Plastic Restrictions for Cafes and Restaurants in Canada. It's a really good guide that breaks down kind of region by region what regulations are applicable to you. So I highly recommend checking that out for more information on the exact regulations for your locations. Broadly speaking, though, the federal regulations are focused on upstream plastic reduction interventions towards the beginning of the supply chain, while provincial and municipal regulations target plastic downstream, a lot closer to your checkout counter, and towards that end of the supply chain. And that's largely due to the different jurisdictional responsibilities of each government. So if we're thinking about the federal government, like I said, it's focused on regulating the upstream effects, so things like import and manufacture of plastic items. And then we also have the plastic registry, and that's what I mentioned earlier as a way to support industries in actually counting how much plastic they're putting out into the market. The point of that plastic registry is really that, giving a cohesive and unified way to count plastic in our economy. We want to do that so that we can see where problematic plastics are coming into the country, how they're being used, where they're getting disposed, and make sure that we are in compliance with international treaties. There's the final negotiation of an international plastic treaty coming up in Busan next month. With that plastic registry, it is going to be starting next year for plastic packaging. So if you are putting your own packaging out into the market, you might be subject to that regulation. If you have any questions about that for your individual business, be happy to chat about that a little bit later on. Provincial and municipal regulations and bylaws are a little bit more targeted, and they're going to be primarily concerned with waste management and the local environmental effects. These are going to be, these are more likely to affect your business because they are going to require implementation of new operating procedures and new actions from your side to ensure compliance. Often municipal governments are the ones that are responsible for waste management, and they really want to focus on reduction of waste as much as possible. So that's really their motivation for some of these single-use item bans. An additional regulation to be aware of is if you're in Ontario, you might be subject to the Ontario Waste Audit Regulation, which is called Ontario 102/94. You are going to be subject to that if for all of the restaurants you operate over the last 2 calendar years, you've done more than $3 million in sales. If you have, what that requires you to do is to do a waste audit and then keep an up-to-date waste management plan. They have a template sort of thing that you should be filling out, but really it's to make sure that you are properly and responsibly managing your waste. So why are governments regulating plastics? Why have we seen all this coming out? It's because when they end up in the environment, they don't decompose. What they do is they break down into smaller and smaller pieces that never really go away. These are microplastics. It's problematic for habitat, for wildlife health, and for our own health as well. You guys might have seen On the weekend, there was an article that came out about dolphins that are now breathing in and out microplastics. That's really the sort of thing that they're trying to avoid. Microplastics also make it a lot more difficult for our ocean to mitigate climate change. When phytoplankton are ingesting microplastics, their ability to photosynthesize and sequester carbon is reduced. That said, not all plastic is bad. We know that there's a lot of necessary plastics in things like transportation, so planes, cars, as well as in the medical field. And we're not saying that that's all bad. What we want to focus on is unnecessary and problematic and unmanageable plastics that are likely to end up in the environment. That's what we should really be focusing on eliminating. So we define problematic plastics as ones that are either likely to end up in the environment, have properties that are toxic or cause negative health effects, or are unrecyclable or undivertible. So an example of plastics that are likely to end up in the environment are dirty dozen, which I mentioned earlier, cigarette butts, bottle caps, coffee cups, things like that. And our shoreline cleanup teams keep this data of all the litter cleanups that we facilitate and publish the top 12 items that we find. This has been used for regulation in the past on which sorts of items should be targeted for regulation. The CPP, which is the Canadians Plastic Pact. It's a plastics industry group here in Canada, part of a wider international network of plastic pacts across the world. They have also published a list of unnecessary and problematic plastics. This list takes into account environmental effects, toxicity, waste management outcomes, as well as the availability of viable alternatives. And this list, as you can see, it identifies both particular plastic items that are problematic, like checkout bags and straws, as well as resins and some characteristics of plastics that are problematic, largely due to either toxicity or how difficult they are to manage in the current waste management landscape. You'll notice things like multi-material flexibles on this list, which probably make up a lot of the packaging that you get, particularly in your back of house. The CPP and the plastics industry is also looking at investments in infrastructure to try to manage some of this material a little bit better. One of the challenges they often come up against, though, is the packaging industry moves a lot faster than the recycling infrastructure industry. So they can't always catch up to what types of packaging types are out there with expensive recycling infrastructure. So they're always playing that catch-up game, and that infrastructure gets very expensive. So, whoop, sorry about that. Here we are. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the recycling symbols and certifications that you might see now. So in Canada, what's really important to note is that there's likely going to be standards for recycling labels. There is a draft regulation out there that would standardize what the Mobius loop, the recycling symbol, what it means, and then what sorts of additional information goes along with it and what sorts of packaging it can go on. There's been a draft out there for about 2 years now. We haven't yet seen it finalized or move forward in the timeframe that we thought it would. I believe there's some negotiations around compostable labeling, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that's holding it up. But I do still expect that to come forward at some point soon. But what that means is, as it is right now, the symbols and recycling information that you find on your packaging doesn't necessarily mean what you think it does. So in plastic packaging, you'll see the Mobius loop, again, that recycling symbol, and a number inside. That doesn't mean it's recyclable. What that means is that's the sort of resin that it's made out of. Often we find resins 1, 2, and 5 are recyclable, but that is going to vary place to place depending on what kind of recycling infrastructure there is in your community. On other types of packaging, fiber, paper, metal, glass, those Mobius loops don't have a standardized meaning, although those things are more likely to be recyclable. We also see the how to recycle label starting to be more and more prevalent in Canada. Started down in the States, we're starting to see it more here. That had more information that's a little bit more standardized, but still a lot of that will say check locally, which doesn't really give you or your consumers that information that they need on how to properly manage that material. So we're going to move on to compostable and biodegradable plastics. But before we start talking about them, let's just think a little bit about what composting is. So organic materials rot. What if we could control the rotting so that it's breaking down more efficiently? We can create optimal conditions for composting to ensure that aerobic organisms, so the ones that need air, are the ones that are breaking down materials into a nutritious soil-like product instead of anaerobic, the ones that exist without air. Um, instead of those anaerobic organisms breaking down the material, and that creates a slimy goop and then a lot of methane, which is a major contributor to climate change. So for good compost, we need greens, which is high nitrogen organic material. We need browns, high carbon organic material, water, air, and thyme. That's what makes good compost. Same thing for your backyard. If you've got a compost heap in your backyard, things like grass, mix it with leaves, give it some time, give it some water, turn it over, you're going to get a really nice compost material at the end. So if we think about these composting concepts and apply it to plastic, we can imagine what we're looking for is a chemical structure that acts like plastic when we want it to. It has that durable form that we can turn into any kind of shape that we want. But it's also going to break down into compost, and those chemical chains are going to break apart when we want them to, under those controlled compost conditions. That's really what compostable plastic is trying to achieve. So let's take a look at this chart here. It shows 4 categories of plastics based on how biodegradable it is. That's the y-axis, and what it's made out of, which is the x-axis. The bottom left quadrant are the traditional plastics that you see. They're going to be made from petroleum. They're not biodegradable. They are recyclable. The top left quadrant is petroleum-based plastics that are biodegradable. The top right quadrant is biodegradable plastic that's made from a renewable resource. And then the bottom right quadrant is the plastics that's made from renewable resources, but is not biodegradable. Now let's take a look at the circles. Everything except traditional plastic has been described as a bioplastic. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the word bioplastic doesn't really mean anything because it's trying to mean so many different things. It could mean that the item is made from a renewable resource, or it could mean that the item is designed to break down. So when we're evaluating alternative plastics, that word bioplastic does not mean really anything. What you want to do is look for a term that describes either the item's composition, so what it's made out of, or the item's waste management outcome. If they're trying to use one term to describe both of those, it's going to be very misleading. So if your goal is to purchase something that is compostable, so something that is going to break down into an organic matter, you want to look for certifications like either BPI, certified compostable, or the B&Q certification, which is going to be more common in Quebec. Those 2 standards meet either ASTM or ISO standards for compostability and degradation. That means that those certification bodies have tested how well that item breaks down in an industrial composting facility. And that's really key, that term industrial composting facility. We'll think about that again in a moment. But you need to look a little bit further when you're thinking about purchasing the compostable items. So the compostable certifications point to these materials breaking down, as I said, in an industrial composting facility within a set amount of time. So that means that both you and your customers, if you're giving them those materials to take home, are going to need access to that composting facility, and that composting facility is going to be willing to accept the material. In many places in Canada, what we find is that the rules for commercial collection or ICI collection, which is what you have at your restaurant versus what is happening for residents, have different rules, even if it's all going to the same compost facility. So if we think about that, that means that your customer who might be taking that compostable dishware home with them may not be able to compost that dishware, even if you can at your restaurant and it's going to that same facility. Something else to note is that in Canada, we don't really have a home compostable certification. That is a thing in Europe. In Canada, we don't really do that. Home composting is a little bit more challenging here because it gets really cold for most of the year. And then we also have bears in a lot of the country, which again, make composting a little bit of a different challenge. So if you are operating in a place with access to an industrial compost facility that's willing to take the material, and your customers are also able to get the material there, when is it a good time to use it? So the best use case for compostable material is when it's going to be touching food or for packaging that is likely to be ending up contaminated with food. So food, grease, oil, things like that make traditional mechanical recycling a lot harder. So that's where compostable plastics and compostable packaging start to make a lot more sense. It can also support an organics diversion, so getting leftover food waste out of the landfill and into a compost facility. If you think about it, a lot of people I know like to, stuff their leftover food into some dishware and then throw it all out together. If we can get it all in one stream, it helps to divert that organic waste. If we think through the waste hierarchy, though, we want to look at reuse first. But if that's not reasonable and you're in an area where compostable packaging is acceptable for both ICI, that restaurant waste, and residential, it might make sense to switch to a compostable if you can get that certified compostable packaging. If your customer is not able to compost compostable packaging at home, it probably doesn't make sense to give it to them unless they're going to be bringing it back to your restaurant, in which case you might as well go to a reuse system because you're asking the same thing from them. Another consideration is, even if it is acceptable, is it going to get through the screening process? The image that we have here, this is from the Edmonton Waste Management Center. This is a pile of compost that is waiting to get screened. That's screened for contaminants, where they're going to take out all the plastics, all of that white stuff you can see in there. That is plastic and contamination. So is compostable packaging going to make it through that screening process? If it looks like plastic, it's probably going to get screened out. So it might not end up where you think it's going to, and it's going to end up in a landfill anyways after the screening process. One more consideration when we're thinking about compostable packaging, if it isn't a compostable plastic and it's fiber-based, is to think about PFAS or PFOS. Those are what are commonly referred to as the forever chemicals. Not as prevalent as they were a few years ago, but it is still something to be aware of. We've seen some regulation around PFAS down in the States. It's likely to be coming into Canada. It's often used on fiber packaging because it's water and grease resistant. It's the same sort of stuff that you find on Teflon pans and often on like chef jackets and kitchen clothing because it is, like I said, grease resistant. The health effects of PFAS have been known since the 70s. There was more studies on it in the 90s, and then in the 2010s is where it really started to get into the public's attention. Due to the high likelihood of some upcoming regulation around PFAS or PFOS, it's best to start screening that out of your supply chain now so that you can get ahead of that and not wait for the regulation to catch up on you. So we'll move on to diversion and some useful metrics. So if you want to improve your business's waste management outcomes, there's a few metrics to be aware of. Waste generation is my favorite one. I find it's the most useful. And it's just looking at how much material you're disposing of, waste, recycling, organics. That's all a cost to you as a business. So you want to reduce all of it. It can also really easily be turned into an intensity ratio. So something like waste generation per customer, per meal served, compared to revenue, things like that. So then as you grow, you're easily able to see if you are in a meaningful way reducing your waste. Lastly, it also better reflects in other metrics if you've been able to do any overall waste reduction or implement any reuse metric or any reuse strategies. Diversion rate is probably the one that you're most familiar with, and that's just how much of your waste material you're producing is getting recycled versus going to landfill. If you report to anything like BOMA or LEED, I think B Corp looks at it as well. A lot of them are looking for a diversion rate. I'm not a big fan of it because you can really easily, what's the nice way to say it? You can adjust it by doing things like if you give your customers too much food and then get it composted, you're artificially inflating your diversion rate, and it's not very meaningful. It also doesn't necessarily reflect if you implement any reduction or reuse systems, because those items that you might be switching to a reuse would have been recycled. Now your diversion rate's actually going to be going down. So I don't think it's a very fair or very useful metric to be looking at in isolation. Capture rate is how much of a recyclable material you're capturing in the correct stream. So for example, if you have 100 kilograms of food waste and 40 of it is going into the compost bin, you've got a 40% capture rate. This stat is really useful if you are doing more investigation into your existing recycling system, trying to find some holes in the system. But it is pretty difficult to properly calculate without doing a full waste audit, which obviously is can get kind of expensive. So useful if you are doing some investigation into your current system. If you're reporting into LEED, you might need that as well. But for most people, I wouldn't recommend something to be looking at as one of your main KPIs. Wish cycling is putting an item into your recycling bin and just kind of hoping it gets recycled because it's similar to other things that are acceptable. Wish cycling is really just contamination. It's going to lead to more costs from your hauler, so it's going to just increase your cost of your overall waste management program. It might increase your diversion rate, which might look good, but it's not ultimately doing the right thing. It's not getting more material diverted. It's just adding in an extra step at the material recovery facility where they're going to have to screen out that stuff. The best thing to do if you're not sure about an item and you can't call your hauler to find out if it is recyclable is probably to put it in the landfill. So we'll go on to managing front and back of house plastic waste. So we'll start at the front of house. Reusables for dine-in solve a lot of the sorting issues that you might be having, a lot of contamination issues. Customers tend to be understand what's reusable and know that that needs to go into a separate bin, often just a tray. It's going to reduce the amount of space you need in your back of house for recycling, waste, and organics bins because you're going to probably have less of them. And then you're also going to save money on your waste and recycling collection overall. If you do need to have disposables, the more of a single material that you can use, the easier it's going to be for your customer. So for example, don't have some compostable packaging and some recyclable packaging. You're going to end up with contamination in both of those bins because it starts to get confusing for your customers. Try to just have either all compostables or all recyclable material. And make sure that you're educating your customers on exactly what to do. So don't make people guess. Again, that's going to lead to more contamination, which is going to lead to more costs. If you can be really clear and explicit on the signs, so if there's an item, say a coffee cup that needs to go in a particular bin, put a picture of that coffee cup above the bin. That's going to tell your customers exactly what to do. Also make sure that your staff knows so that if customers are asking your staff, they can really clearly communicate the message. So for managing your back of house plastic waste, because there is diversion possible in your back of house, again, keep it simple. So only put the relevant bins near stations that need it. So for example, if you have a prep station where all staff is doing is cutting vegetables all day, just give them an organics bin because they're probably not going to have a whole lot of other recycling. Make sure that you're including waste management information, recycling information in your staff onboarding and training. Recycling is going to be different from one restaurant to the next. It's also definitely going to be different from what people are doing at home. So make sure that you're providing your new staff that information so they don't spend unnecessary time, again, having to think about it, not sure about what to do, ultimately contaminating bins, which is just going to add cost to you. Work with your suppliers if you find that they're delivering you a whole bunch of unnecessary packaging. Unnecessary packaging, it's a cost to you because you now have to pay staff to unpackage things more, and then you're going to pay to dispose of it. If you ask your suppliers and work with your suppliers to get less packaging, that's going to save you some costs in the long run. And then where possible, implement some reuse systems. One of the ones that I see fairly commonly, which is nice, is reusable pallets for things like breads and buns. If a restaurant had to throw out or pay to dispose of each of those pallets, that cost is going to add up really, really quickly. But this is a nice reuse system to save costs both on the bread supplier as well as the restaurant side. So talk to your suppliers and see if there's other areas for reusable packaging to get implemented. So last thing for me, key takeaways, as I mentioned a couple times, implement reuse systems where you can. Saves a lot of these disposal questions. You don't have to think about them as much. It's going to be a cost saver. Research your local waste management system. So talk to your hauler. For your customers, you can either call your local municipalities, or often they have a tool on their website called the Waste Wizard that'll tell you what's recyclable and what's not. For compostable packaging, look for those certifications, BPI or BNQ. You can track your waste generation and your diversion metrics. You can't improve it if you don't measure it. And then make sure that you are educating your customers and staff about how to use your recycling system. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Natalie.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate all of the information there. It's actually even some information that I wasn't aware of, so that's great to hear. Yeah, my name is Natalie. I'm the accounts manager with our Fisheries and Seafood Initiative. So we're going to have a little bit of a shorter session, just on like the basics of sustainable seafood, why it's important, what to look out for, and how you can be a part of the solution. I do see that currently there's no questions in the Q&A, so I just want to point back down to that option for you at the bottom of your Zoom. There is a little Q&A button. I know there's lots of you on the call, so please feel free to pop questions in there as we go. I'll be keeping an eye on that diligently as I go through my sustainable seafood section. I'm sure Jeff would love to have some questions at the end of the session as well. And with that, we will head into my first slide. So just a little bit of an overview for you of fishing in general and how much has changed over the last couple of decades, because it has changed so dramatically. And this is kind of what is creating our global issue of overfishing. So this map here is of 1950s commercial fishing. So what it looked like in terms of catch per year in tons. So the blue areas are areas that are a little bit less intensively being fished, and then you slide into the greens, yellows, and reds to being more intensely fished, or higher catch is being caught there. So if we look at this map, what we can see, or what stands out to me, is that really most of our fishing is happening right in at the coast, right in at land. You can see in between the continents there's no coloration. There's no blue, there's no yellow, and no red. So we are not fishing too far away from land, which is what was happening in 1950s based on the technology that we had. And of course, that isn't the technology that we have today. And so you can see there was a lot of space back then for fisheries and for species to be in areas where they would not be harvested. So there was areas where, species could recover. We weren't harvesting too far away from land. But that has changed a lot since the 1950s. So if we move forward onto the next slide with the 2010s, what we'll see here is a really big explosion in how far and how wide we are able to fish. So this is what fishing's looking like, I guess, a decade ago now, so even more intense at this stage. So you can see there really isn't much area of our international waters, even far away from the coast, that we aren't harvesting. So there isn't much space for species to escape harvesting, to recover. We really are exploiting the entirety of our oceans, and that is because of the improvements in technology. There are vessels that essentially stay out in the middle of the ocean in perpetuity. So they'll stay out, they'll fish, there'll be another vessel that comes, collects the catch, provides resources and fuel, and comes back to land. So some of these boats never really leave their fishing zones. And that means that we are just seeing a huge increase in the amount of fish that we are fishing on a global basis. And that is really because we have an increasing demand for seafood. So in the next slide, what we'll see is that we have been increasing our demand for seafood over a number of decades. So in this visual that you're seeing, the pink colors are for aquaculture or farmed seafood, and then the blue colors are for wild capture seafood. And there are a couple of different categories in there, but don't mind too much about those. So as you can see, from the 1950s up until kind of our time now, the increase in seafood demand has been dramatic. So it is globally what people's most kind of sought after primary protein, because it is easily accessed if you are an individual from a lower financial background, but you live by the coast. A lot of people use subsistence fishing to provide for their families. So we have just seen a huge increase in that demand for protein from the sea. So with the state of our fisheries, we've also seen diversification here. So you can see that aquaculture, or fish farming in particular, has increased exponentially since the early 90s, really. And that is because we have such an increasing demand for seafood year over year. And so we really do need to diversify where our seafood comes from. And actually in 2023, I believe it was the first year that for food, for human consumption, more of our food was actually coming from farmed seafood than it was coming from wild capture. And so I just wanted to point that out because I do think there is a common misconception that all wild seafood is inherently bad or unsustainable. And I just wanted to outright say that there are good and bad actors in both. There is sustainable wild-caught, but also very unsustainable wild-caught seafood, and the same in the aquaculture sectors as well. So we do, as OceanWise, we do have recommendations in both sectors. So you can see that the demand for seafood is ever increasing. I think it's on a 3% increase year over year at the moment. And that has made some critical impacts into our fisheries and the availability of seafood globally. So on the next slide, what we'll see is that the percentage of fisheries and fish stocks that are fished to capacity or overfished has been increasing steadily over the last couple of decades. So you can see back in 1950s, only about 15% of our fish stocks, so this is wild seafood, were being fished to capacity. And actually the overfish number is actually negligible at that stage in time. Into the 1980s, we're getting into 75% are fished to capacity or overfished. And then into the 2010s, we're now at about 93%. So if we're breaking down the fish to capacity or overfished, I do want to make sure that we're clear on what the difference is there. So fish to capacity means we are harvesting that resource right to the edge of its limitations. We really can't increase the amount that we're fishing that stock. Otherwise, we'll be sliding into that problem of overfishing the stock, where it will be dwindling and won't be able to recover. And then overfishing, of course, being that side of the coin where we are over harvesting a resource. And so we are reducing that resource year over year. So currently the total seafood that is fished to capacity or overfished is about 93% of our global catch. But in terms of what is in that overfished or overharvested category, that is sitting at about 35% out of that 93 is the overfished category, the rest being that fish to capacity category. So we are at a critical point in time at the moment where we are, for the majority of our fisheries, in that fish to capacity stage, which is both a benefit and can potentially be a curse for us as well, because we're at that stage where we can make meaningful improvements to ensure that those fisheries don't slip over the edge and become overfished. And so we are at a critical point in time where we can make decisions to benefit our fisheries and ensure that we make sure that they're healthy for generations to come. So in terms of that, what we are actually seeing as well from a consumer perspective on the next slide is that consumers are increasingly wanting to know about the sustainability of their seafood. So these are some stats from some studies, and if you'd like to know where they're from, happy to share it at any point in time. But about 70% of consumers polled in North America want to hear more from companies about their sustainability efforts. So this is terrestrial and aquatic that they're wanting to hear from you. And then 88% want confidence that they're buying a sustainable product. So they want to know at the point of sale or purchase that what they're buying is a sustainable choice and good for the planet. And interestingly, in a study of 21 different countries, of which Canada was one, 50% of people are willing to pay more for a sustainable product, all things being equal in terms of like taste and quality and things like that. So this is just telling us that consumers are really wanting this in the market. There is demand for it. So from a pure dollar perspective as well, that 50% is telling us that you can potentially be charging a little bit more for sustainable seafood if you're in the right kind of market and the right audience. Then that can make financial sense for your business and also good sense for the ocean as well. So that's just to say that sustainability doesn't have to only make good environmental sense. It can also make good business sense as well. So if you've come to the decision that you want to be working on sustainable seafood in your business, how do you go about doing that? Who are the players and programs to look out for? On our next slide, we're going to see some of the seafood logos that you're probably going to most commonly come across in the industry. So the most important thing I will say to look out for, regardless of what program or party that you go with, is we're looking for third-party verified sustainability programs. So we are looking for the sustainability program itself to not be within the business that is selling the seafood. Typically, that is a better sign that it has a little bit less subjectivity. It's probably more transparent and clear and has less influence from whoever is selling the seafood, which is a good thing to see. We want it to be based solely on the environmental metrics. And the other thing to look out for is a program that has clear methodology on how they assess sustainability. So transparently showing you on their website or wherever you're getting the information from, how they decide what is sustainable. What do they call sustainable? If they can't show you the methodology behind how they decide what is sustainable or not, that's a clear sign that whatever label that is probably a greenwashing label. So it's really important to understand the methodology, and the more transparent an organization is online for an environmental program, the more likely you're looking at a healthy third-party verified seafood. So in terms of these options, these are kind of the 5 key players that you'll probably see in the Canadian market. So on the wild side, we have MSC, so they are a wild capture certification program. They do cover globally a lot of seafood. They have, certifications for seafood across the world, which is a great benefit for them. They do come under some criticism because they do allow for their fisheries to interact with endangered species for quite long periods of time without any kind of meaningful improvements needing to be made. And that's really gotten them into some hot water in the past. Dolphin Safe, while great for dolphins specifically, is a very limited logo, I would say. It really is looking at the health of cetaceans, so whales, dolphins, and porpoises. It's not really looking at the wider environmental impact. So really what this logo means is that the operator that's catching the seafood isn't using something called a purse seine, which is like a giant net that can entangle whales and dolphins quite easily. So it's probably the least robust out of all 5 here that I would look at. On the farm side, we have ASC. They have quite stringent and rigorous methodology, quite transparent to find out how they assess their seafood, which is great. They are specifically looking at farmed seafood here. And they do also have some indications for social welfare, which is interesting as well. So I'd say this is a fairly robust certification to look out for. The best aquaculture practices, or commonly called BAP, this is a less environmentally focused logo. It is a little bit more about the business practices that are happening in the farm and less about the environmental impact of the farm itself. So I'd say if you're looking to go for a logo that's purely sustainable and not just business practices, BAP probably wouldn't be the standard that I would be looking for. And then OceanWise, which is our program, and I'll be the first to admit that we're biased and would like to say that our program is a great player in the game. But we are an interesting one in that we do encompass both wild and farmed in our recommendation program. So I think that's great because you don't have to look for one or the other. You don't have to be operating with two different programs. So you can get that guidance across the board from our program. And we are also a recommendation program instead of a certification program. And the biggest difference here is that for us, if someone has already done an assessment on a farm or a wild capture seafood already, we don't feel the need to redo that assessment. So we'll take the publicly available data from MSC and ASC and combine that into our methodology and tell you whether that's also OceanWise or not. So those are some of the programs that you can look out for. In terms of our program, on the next slide, we'll just see our logo. You will see this in restaurants, retail, and supplier. And I think that's also what differentiates our program from the market, is that it is seen at all of those levels. So with the likes of MSC and ASC, which I'd say are the other large sustainability program in the market, they really are working directly with suppliers and putting logo on packaged product, but you're very unlikely to see those logos on, a menu, for example, or at the consumer end. So I do think that it is important that consumers really want to understand sustainability. They want to be able to make quick, good choices for the ocean. So having a logo on menu or directly on a product is really important for the consumer, because if you went into the seafood landscape, it's really difficult to understand what is sustainable or not. So on the next slide, you'll see that we work with everyone within the supply chain. So both, harvesters, suppliers, retailers, and restaurants. Anybody who has seafood, we will work with them. And so to join our program, you only need one OceanWise item to start, because we really believe that it is important to focus on progress over perfection. If we only had people joining our program who already had 100% sustainable collection, then it wouldn't really be of benefit to us. We're not really helping anybody progress towards anything that is a better practice. So in terms of how we decide what is sustainable, because I think it's really important to understand methodology, we look at some key criteria that you'll see on the next slide. So this is just an example of what we would measure for a wild capture seafood. So we're looking at things like stock. What is the species that we're harvesting? How vulnerable is it to fishing pressure? So is it long-lived with only a few babies? Is it short-lived with lots of babies? That makes it either inherently more or less vulnerable to fishing. And is there lots of those individual animals in that area that you're fishing? Second thing we'll look at is bycatch. So what are we accidentally catching when we're catching the target species we're going for? And particularly for us, we're really keen on making sure that we are not interacting with critically endangered species along the way. The third thing we'll look at is management. So you can have great bycatch and great stock, but if it's not managed well, then it can easily slide into that overfishing category. So who's managing the fishery? How often are they measuring things? And how well enforced is it if they make changes? And the last thing we'll look at for wild capture is habitat impacts. So of course, using a rod and a line is a very different environmental impact to using something like a trawl that drags along the bottom. So we'll look at all of those different things to measure what is sustainable or not. But you might be a little bit overwhelmed, and you might be just wanting to take that first step, Or you might be in an area where you have operations in a jurisdiction that doesn't have logoed product, or doesn't have a third-party verification program within your region. If you're just looking for some like golden rules to follow when it comes to seafood, we do have that covered as well. So on the next slide, we'll see just a couple of key things that I want to leave you with before we go into our questions, because I've just given you like a quick rundown of sustainable seafood. In terms of golden rules, rule number 1 is, if you can, buy from third-party verified sustainable seafood. So looking for a third-party verified logo on that product is really important. It does mean that someone has done the science behind it to make sure that it is sustainable. In general, though, more selective usually means more sustainable. So, for example, if you are fishing with a rod and a hook, you're pulling one fish out at a time. This is common for tuna. So you'll see on cans often it'll say pull and line caught tuna. And that means that they're fishing one fish at a time. That is much more selective, so less accidental catch of other species or bycatch is happening there than if you caught everything with a giant net, for example, and then you're just catching a huge net of multiple different species and having to, have a lot of bycatch in there. Reducing impacts on the physical environment is also something to be cognizant of. So even if you don't have logoed product, you can find out, how is this fish harvested and what kind of physical impacts might there be on their environment? So again, that idea that a trawl dragging across the ground has a much bigger physical impact than, say, like a rod and a line that would not be interacting with the sea bottom. Globally, OceanWise does recommend farmed bivalves. So bivalves being any animals in a double shell. So oysters, mussels, clams. If they are farmed, they are OceanWise recommended worldwide. So that's a great thing to keep in mind. And they are recommended worldwide because they have no inputs to the system. So there's no feed for these organisms. They are just usually grown on the farm in the filtered water that they are grown in. And then they actually have been shown to provide positives to the environment that they are grown in. So they'll provide habitat for organisms, which is a great benefit. And they usually are sited in areas that are fairly low in species to begin with. So farmed bivalves, farmed kelp, always good, which is great. And also then shows again that there are good sustainable farmed seafood sources. In general, local is great because we want to reduce that carbon footprint. But again, local doesn't necessarily mean environmentally sustainable, because just because it's local doesn't mean that the species isn't being overfished. But still, we want to make sure that we're thinking of the carbon footprint of our seafood as well. And then the last key thing to maybe think about is, globally, we do have a top 10. So we all seem to like to eat cod, shrimp, tuna, crab, that kind of thing. So eating outside of the top 10 is a good way to reduce pressure on the top 10 species that we're already consuming. So it does mean that we would be fishing hopefully less of those and less pressure on those, and hopefully they won't slip into that overfishing category. And lastly, ask your supplier. We know that folks who work at the restaurant level, they aren't required to carry things like Latin name, where is it harvested, how is it harvested on file. So ask your supplier the questions. Where is my seafood coming from? How is it harvested? And is it sustainable? If it is, how does your supplier know? What program are they interacting with, or what information are they carrying that helps them make that decision? Those are some of the golden rules I would point to if you're looking to just make that first step and make a small positive impact on sustainable seafood. But if you're looking to go a little step further, that first rule, that third-party verified sustainable product, is really what you need to look for. And with that, I'll bring it into question time. We have our emails there at the bottom. So jeff.wint@ocean.org. And then my email would be seafood@ocean.org. And you're always welcome to go to our website as well, which is just ocean.org. So always good to find more information there. So I'm going to look through the questions and have a little look. It looks like a lot of them are to do with some of your pieces. Jeff, I think few certifications were mentioned. Which ones do you feel consumers understand and value? I think that's maybe to do with your side. I came in pretty quickly as soon as I started talking, but if that's a seafood question, I think the certifications we went over are probably the ones you'd commonly see, and we did go through the pluses and minuses. Regarding sustainability, how can I make the actions for a difference in my community? Where can I get access to information to learn more? Great idea. And what can we do in our communities to change up packaging? I'll let Jeff speak to packaging, but to learn more, I'd say you can definitely go to our website. And if you ever need resources on either side, whether it's seafood or plastics, you can email us and we're happy to provide those as well. But maybe Jeff, do you want to jump in on the packaging?
Yeah. In your community, changing packaging systems is a real challenge. This is something where voting with your dollar really does have an impact. So if you're looking at it from the restaurant point of view, asking and talking to your suppliers about the packaging they're giving you is really important, as well as thinking about what you're putting out into your community. So is there reusable systems that you can implement? The first place to look would always be, I would say, reusable for dine-in. That is a great way to signal to your community, to your customers, what those values are. It's also a lot nicer for people to be drinking out of a ceramic cup. You can sit down, you can have a conversation using that ceramic cup instead of that single-use disposable cup if you're sitting in. I think those are great ways to start, but talking to your customers and talking to your suppliers, and then supporting that by purchasing into those systems is a great way to start.
I think the next one is also for me, which was a question on overfishing and whether that's based on commercial, industrial fishing, and does it include recreational fishing? This is really dependent country to country. Typically, the answer is no. Recreational fishing isn't counted in the commercial harvest quotas, but we are also looking more into small-scale fisheries, which have been typically unassessed. So about 40% of what we catch globally is quote-unquote small scale, so small numbers or sizes of vessels that are heading out to sea, and a lot of that is unassessed. So actually the picture that we have is incomplete when it comes to overfishing. How can we confirm that the company using the label is actually certified? And if they received the third-party verification 5 years ago, how do I know that today they're still complying with those standards? Great question. So for, I guess, the most common ones that I would say for seafood, the MSC, ASC, and Oceanwise, they cannot legally carry the logo unless they are an up-to-date and paid partner. We do sometimes see, attempts to copy a trademark logo like our own or like MSC's. They're quite quickly found out and they can lead to some quite nasty legal complications for the company. So because it is a trademark symbol, if they are carrying it, you can always ask, and happy to do this for your suppliers, but ask them to provide you with correspondence from the company that says that they are a partner or their certificate that shows that they are an active partner of this year. That's definitely something you can ask for. How would you prioritize different actions that can be implemented by seafood and aquaculture industry to build public trust? I'm not quite sure what this question is getting at. If you have a second, Ina, to just rephrase it for me, I'm not sure what you mean by build public trust. Is there a specific area that you're looking for us to answer that question on? Do you think Canada's waste management systems are more effective in handling the end of life of fiber packaging compared to bioplastics? Jeff?
That's a pretty big question. So right now, in many provinces, you'll see grant programs that are supporting communities and composting facilities to get upgraded. That's both in an effort to increase capture of organic waste, which is a major source of methane in landfills, as well as to bring them up to date to be able to accept more compostable packaging. At the same time, we see that a lot of plastic regulation is starting to ban compostable plastics because the infrastructure is not there to accept it. So in current state, I would say fiber packaging is much more widely accepted. It is more likely to go through a screening process and actually get composted. There are some studies out there that show that the compostable plastics can actually break down a lot better, but we haven't seen the industry catch up to that. And with some of the regulations in place as they are, it kind of hinders compost facilities in really wanting to get up to that place. So I would say fiber packaging is probably better handled at this point. And then the next question is also for me, are your Dirty Dozen ranked by weight or by the number of units? Under paper, is this laminated paper with plastic? So the Dirty Dozen is largely compiled by citizen scientists. So that's people like yourselves. If anyone wants to lead or participate in a shoreline cleanup, please look on the website. So they are just ranked by number of pieces picked up, and the paper is going to be both just paper as well as laminated paper.
And then the last question that we'll go into is Jacob's asking, do you find we may have a shortage of fish or seafood based on demand due to water quality or environmental impact on the fish? And what is the plan forward? I would say that we are at that precipice right now where the majority of our seafood is at that kind of fished to capacity level. So I'd say we aren't at the stage right now where we have this huge shortage in seafood, but we are at the stage where the impacts that we have will potentially lead to shortages if we continue to harvest at the same rates that we are looking to harvest, because we're increasing our demand year over year. And so that's obviously got really detrimental impacts on the species and the environment, but also will then lead to that scarcity of product and potentially increases in product cost as well. So not only environmentally a good thing to avoid overfishing, but financially also a good thing to avoid overfishing as well. And in terms of the plan forward, we are trying to ensure that all businesses can take part in sustainability programs, that they are aware of their impact that they have on the water, because we do see a huge amount of impact at the water level whenever the consumers and the businesses at the top end demand that practice further down. So you can have a meaningful impact. And in terms of environmental impact, there are a lot of pieces in play here in terms of like climate change, pollution, all of those factors. So there would probably be too many to go into. We probably need to run an entire new webinar on that section. But with that, maybe I'll pass it back to Anna. But please feel free to write down our emails, and please feel free to get in touch for any other questions you might have from the session today.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Jeff and Natalie, for such an informative session. And again, I know from the operator standpoint, there's a lot to be learning. There's an operation to be running. There's a team to manage. I think sometimes, when it comes to the topic of sustainability, it might be a little bit daunting for folks. So I think definitely what I learned today with all of the engagement of the questions as well is people are looking for more information, and really just information that is quick and easy to be able to apply to their businesses. So again, thank you so much, Oceanwise. And, we always have Oceanwise at our Restaurants Canada show, which is April 7th to 9th of 2025. Always having some sort of session there. So if you are looking for more Oceanwise content, we would love to see you at the show as well. Visit rcshow.com. And again, thank you, everybody. And you will be receiving the court recordings and also additional resources as well, 24 to 48 hours from today. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.